Hello everybody, I'm Lizzy with Lizzy Digital. I am a queer and inclusive elopement and wedding photographer and videographer. So many adjectives to describe who I am, but that's me. Currently based in Denver, Colorado, but we'll be moving to the New England area in September. My wife and I are planning to... Oh, I forgot to put my ring on. I forgot my ring! The ring in question. Okay, anyway, my wife and I are planning on building a trailer so that we can just move around everywhere. As long as I'm within a couple hours of an international airport, I can do my job from anywhere, which is really cool. Because if you would have asked me 4 years ago if that was a possibility, I would have been like, what the heck? No. So, kind of crazy. I got my cold brew. It's in a glass that one of my elopement clients gave me, Anna and Gracia, from their Sedona elopement. I use this for so many fun drinks all the time. Yeah. So, it's pretty cute. But, anyway, iced coffee with pistachio creamer, and it's a new iced coffee brand that I have tried, called Bizzy. B-I-Z-Z-Y. So it matches Dizzy Lizzy. But it actually tastes really good. Highly recommend. For some reason, Chai Dog's growling. Anyway, one of the questions that this is crazy, sporadic all over the place. I'm feeling like, it's probably the cold brew. Honestly, I feel like I'm talking really fast too. Anyway, one of the questions this week that multiple people have said, wow, that would be so helpful to talk about, was how to handle low light situations and how to use flash. I realized a lot of people really struggle with this. Oftentimes, people just don't know how to work their camera. Not all of the settings for my camera are going to be the same as they would be for yours, or for every lighting situation is different. You should be able to get to a point where you can look at a room and kind of know what to do. You have to think about so many factors, like where the light is going to fall once it hits a ceiling, or if it's even going to bounce off of a ceiling. Is the ceiling too dark for it to bounce off of? Do you want a direct flash vibe? How high of flash power do you need? So many things go into flash photography, so I just figured I would kind of break down the basics and talk about what I do, and maybe right here I'll put little pictures of examples of how I handle those situations and what the end product looks like. Just let me talk about what flash I use. I use the Godox V1. I feel like I've heard a lot of people talk badly about this flash, but it has been 10 out of 10 amazing for me. I recently switched over from using Fujifilm systems to Sony, and I had a V1 from my Fujifilm. Never ever had any issues with it, and now I just purchased one for my Sony, which I'm pretty excited about. So it comes in a cute little Velcro case like this, and this is what she looks like. Pretty neat, pretty cool. This back here can seem kind of intimidating when you're very first learning how to use your flash, but that's why I'm here. So if you make sure your battery's charged, you turn it on and it makes a really neat noise like that, and it looks like this. I keep my flash in TTL mode like it is here for the most part. That just is what works best for me. Change the settings with this little fun lightning bolt looking button. You can connect this flash to multiple different flashes so they all work together. That was hot. But that's what it looks like. I also have this really cool attachment. It's just magnetic, and it just sits on the top like so, and it just diffuses the light for me. Slides right on in. It's locked. It's not going to go anywhere, I hope. And this is what I'm working with. I usually have my flash angled mostly up, not usually straight up, but just a little bit more down, because most of the time the flash will bounce off of a ceiling and then fall onto my clients the way that I like it, where it's not going to create harsh shadows. The biggest thing that I would recommend is keeping your ISO the same. So I usually keep mine around like 400 when you have your flash on. A lot of cameras have a really cool capability where you can see what the image looks like when it is properly exposed, but that's not what the image actually ends up looking like, if that makes sense. So like when you're looking through your camera, it's like you can still see everything. If your settings are like super wonky for flash, oftentimes you won't be able to see the image on your screen unless you have that setting activated, where it shows like preview, white balance, and exposure mode. My Fujifilm had it. I haven't messed around with my Sony, but I'm assuming that the Sony also has it. But for now, if you just leave your flash on TTL, set your ISO to around 400. Sometimes I toggle between anywhere in between 200 and 400 for my ISO is like a good starting point. And then you can mess with the f-stop so that you can control how much light is being let in. If you have too much light being let in when you have your flash, everything is just going to look really white and it's going to be way too bright, which is also where this comes in handy, being able to switch where it's pointed. If you want like those really cool hotel, Great Gatsby for some reason is always what I think of, 1920s like newspaper paparazzi looking photos, direct flash. Just have it pointing straight at them. Diffused is nice, but also not necessary. I've made it work both ways. Then your shutter speed. If you have your shutter speed at around 1/50, you can do some really, really cool shutter drag. And shutter drag is always fun when your shutter speed is slower with flash, because the image is still pretty clear and you can usually get people in focus, but then the background is blurry and it just looks cinematic as heck. It's one of my favorite things to do. I highly recommend trying that out. And when you do shutter drag, you just want to follow your subject and just yeet your camera. So you're going to be like, move it around, shake it up. Make sure your flash is charged, and it's never a bad idea to have two, just so you have a backup. For some reason, flash scares a lot of people. A lot of it, honestly, is just trial and error, but I would recommend picking an ISO to stick to between 200 and 400, depending on how much depth of field you want as well. And then if your f-stop is around 4.5, anywhere from 4.5 to like 11, if you just mess around and take some test shots, you'll be good. And then that's where the shutter speed comes into play. The lower your ISO is and the larger your f-stop is, the more light you'll let in, and it's larger because the aperture is actually opening, but the number gets smaller. So f1.8 is like, let's let this much light in. f22 is like, let's let this much light in, tiny little amount. So yeah, if you just mess around with your f-stop and how much light, if you just think of it that way, like, okay, how much light do I want to let in? My flash is going to compensate for so much light. You don't want too much light. So you can make your f-stop smaller, which is anywhere from f4.5 to f22, or as closed down as your aperture goes. Lower ISO, because ISO helps compensate for light. Like, think of if you are into film photography and you get Kodak Gold that only has an ISO of 200. It's really difficult to shoot Kodak Gold when it's cloudy outside. Or if you're even like indoors, it's really difficult to shoot with Kodak Gold and have it be clear because the ISO is only 200. There's not a lot of exposure compensation unless you have flash. It can sound like a jumble of a mess, but honestly, I feel like that's a really good place to start with photography, is just understanding how your f-stop, your shutter speed, and your ISO, the exposure triangle, all work together. it comes in handy if you really have a good grasp on that. If you can just like think of what your exposure equation would be without flash, it's really easy to translate it with flash. And honestly, once you have a good starting point, which I recommend like f5.6, ISO 200, and shutter speed at like 1/80, that's a good starting point. And if it's too bright, adjust something. So if you start at f5.6, go to f8. If that's not enough, go to f11. Just mess around with each setting until it has that like vibe and look that you want. I would rather have a slower shutter speed so I can have that shutter drag and do some like cool weird stuff with my camera than have a shallower depth of field with a larger f-stop like 1.8 or 1.4. But that's just my personal preference. I don't enjoy off-camera flash. I have done it before. I will use it if I feel like it is beneficial to the scenario, but most of the time I work with like really intimate weddings or elopements where just having like multiple light stands up isn't practical, and like the direct flash vibe is super rad. It just makes it look like old and vintage, which is a huge part of my brand, so it works for me. If you're trying to get like the perfectly evenly lit photos with like multiple, like 4 flashes all in corners and stuff, this is not the video for you. But if you just want to like make some cool artsy shit, one flash should be more than enough to work with, especially once you start to get down how to use your flash. And honestly, I've stood in a dark room. I've done this a lot with my film cameras. I've just like stood in a darker, like turned all the lights off in here when it's nighttime, and then just like wrote down each setting each time I took a picture, and then I would get the film developed, and then I'd be like, okay, this type of lighting, when it's like really dark, these settings work super well. When it's like a little bit lit with like fairy lights and stuff, this lighting works really well. So highly recommend I will always recommend the Godox V1, but if honestly you can make any flash work, it just is all based on personal experience and how much effort you're putting into learning your flash and learning your camera. Another fun thing that I like to use, I feel like I use this more for video than I do for photo, and a lot of people, I always have to give a disclosure before I use it because people are like, hey, it's so bright and it just ruins the mood and it's just so bright. So, sorry, that made me sound like I was mocking people, but I understand it is very bright, but sometimes it's necessary. Is my Lume Cube. I love using the little honeycomb grid. It just like diffuses it perfectly while still having the light focused on the subject. But dang, she's bright. You can adjust the intensity of how bright it is, but I like to use this for video because it keeps a constant light on your subject, especially if it's during reception and I want to get like really candid documentary moments. I'll just put that on my camera. Most of the time people are partying so hard that like they don't even notice, and if they do notice, they're like, that's so bright, and then they just go back to dancing. So I also like to use it for concert photography or like concert videos because it's just a nice constant light. Or if your subject is backlit, this is great to provide light to the front of your subject so that they're not just a silhouette once you take the photo or video. The Lume Cube is another option. This is a little bit more constant. It can kind of make things difficult if you're using this for video and you're working with a photographer. Sometimes it can mess it up for the photographer because it casts a specific light onto the subjects, and so I have mine set for pretty warm because I edit more warmly, but you can adjust all of that. It even has like fun party modes where it's like a strobe light. Lots of different options, but I would just be aware if you're working with somebody else alongside you to maybe not just have it on like 24/7. That would be annoying. Lastly is just low light situations without flash. So many people are terrified because they're like, I can't have any grain in my photos. I can't have any blur in my photos. But if you do it right, it looks really cool. It's possible to capture the ambiance of a room, even when it's darkly or dimly lit, without flash. A lot of people want that romantic kind of orangey candlelight aesthetic. And I am a sucker for it. I think it looks so cool. I don't like the way places look when people use flash, but you can tell that it was supposed to be like a dark moment. It just like ruins the whole vibe, in my opinion. So for low light, number one thing, get a really fast lens. Get a lens that has 1.8, 1.4, 1.2, I've even seen, for the f-stop. That lets in so much light. And honestly, it'd be really difficult to get a great image with a lens that only goes down to f4 if it's extremely low light. If you, let's say you're working in a barn that doesn't have any white ceilings, it's all dark wood, and there's like a few windows, but once it's nighttime, those windows aren't going to help you with anything. This is where you need to just like go for it and be comfortable with low light situations. If you are super shaky like me after I've had 5 cold brews, don't be afraid to bust out a tripod. Don't be afraid to use the table that is unoccupied at a wedding. I'll literally sometimes set my camera on a windowsill, a bookshelf, a table, just so that I'm not moving it. I hike up my ISO. Again, depending on what camera system you have, most of the time, especially these days with mirrorless, if you hike up your camera to like at least 6400 ISO, that should help. That should help immensely. And if you have it on a tripod, that eliminates the shake, and the higher ISO is going to allow more exposure compensation and like light to be let in, essentially. It makes your image more light sensitive. If you do those things, along with having a lens that has an f-stop of, you know, like 2.8 and lower or higher, depending on how you look at it, you'll be solid. And utilizing like what is in your surroundings has been a lifesaver for me, at least, and I highly recommend it for people. It's okay to use a tripod. I don't know why people are like weird about it, but I feel like sometimes they are. Use a tripod if it's going to get you that like super rad image of people hugging on the dance floor. Like, that'll look so cool with like some candle lights or some fairy lights or something, or like nighttime with like the moon in the background or something. Low light photography scares a lot of people, and a lot of people just like don't want to mess with it. But if you just have patience and you know how to handle your camera in those situations, you'll be really surprised what kind of images you can get. When you first see an image just like straight out of the camera that you shot in low light, it's gonna look bad. It is not gonna be cute. But that's where the editing comes into play with white balance specifically. A lot of low light images come out extremely orange, like too orange for my liking. So adjusting the white balance to get those images to the right temperature is a great starting point. You can crop it, you can even like adding some purposeful motion blur can make a low light situation really cool and cinematic. It just depends on how you do it. Low light photography shouldn't be scary, but the only way that you're gonna learn what works best for your camera, or like the main lens that you utilize, is by just practicing. One thing that's really helpful is like if I turn off all the lights and I just turn on like a lamp that's like pretty dimly lit, and I just set up 2 little Lego people or something, 2 little figurines, and just practice photographing them. Practice putting your camera on a tripod. Practice putting your camera on a desk or a table and just like lightly pressing the shutter. You should be able to have your shutter speed as low as 1/60 in that situation, as long as you hike up your ISO and you have your aperture wide open at 1.4 to 2.8, anywhere in between there, and get a usable image that, even if it has a little grain, like lean into the grain. That's one thing that I enjoy about doing more non-traditional vintage aesthetic retro photography, is that I'm not afraid of grain, and I actually use grain to my advantage. It's like an artistic style choice, not, oh my god, I had to make my ISO so high, like this image is unusable because there's grain. Not here. I refuse to trash a good picture just because it has some grain. I'm like, it's cool, it looks like film, but it's my digital camera. So just some thoughts on that. If you have an image that you feel like, like something's missing, but it's like almost there, that you shot in low light, switch that shit to black and white. Sometimes switching an image like that to black and white, if you just cannot get the white balance right, it looks so good. It just looks like really cinematic. Yeah, it looks like a scene from a movie. A lot of people, I think, struggle with editing. And so if you just practice, white balance is like the first thing that folks should nail with photography. And even when I was using my Fujifilm system, it was really difficult to get the white balance right sometimes. I don't know why, but I've found it to be a lot easier with my Sony. I think my Sony is just a lot more crisp and clear. But again, it's not about the system that you use, it's about your knowledge and like what you do with your knowledge with your camera. A quick recap: Godox V1, I keep it on TTL and I just adjust my camera settings. You can adjust on the flash. Let's see if it'll focus. Here, the strength of the flash, like it's not on, but if it was on, you'd be able to see like +3, +7, +9, or whatever the increments are. And you can turn this little thing up or down to increase or decrease the flash power, which will also put out either more light or less light, which can be really helpful. If you've like put all the settings on your camera, like I feel like this should work, or I want this to work so I can have shutter drag at like 1/40, 1/50 for your shutter speed, adjust the strength of the flash. Sorry, I burped. Adjust the strength of the flash. All of the light is coming from this thing, and that's what you have to remember. Your camera is only going to process what you tell it to process. So getting your settings right is so important. Also, I wouldn't recommend going over 1/125 for your shutter speed for flash. I think the highest you can go is 1/250 before you start getting black lines, which is literally your shutter, because your shutter is too fast for the camera to process the light that is coming into the image. Your flash pops like that. But if you have a shutter speed of over 1/250, anything faster than that, it's too fast to capture the whole flash. So you'll just see these like black rectangles in your images, or like half the image will be kind of black or dark shadowy, and then the rest of it will be super light. One thing I also didn't mention about the Godox V1 is like play around with where your flash is facing. Are you going to bounce it so that you have the light fall evenly over people? Or are you going to do a little bit of an angle so you get some cool like Rembrandt shadows on the side of your nose? What vibe are you going for? Definitely grab a friend and like go shoot somewhere outside at night that like kind of has some of that nighttime ambiance, and practice no flash and then practice with flash, because it can look really cool. Especially if you utilize street lights or fairy lights or candles, or there's so many cool lighting sources that just make or break a photo. If you're obviously in like a pitch black room, that's a whole other story. You would need to have like a second long exposure. So you would have to have your shutter open for a very long time, which is where I would recommend a remote release cable, or a lot of cameras these days can do it like through Bluetooth. Like you can do it from your phone, like hold down the shutter and let it go, which is pretty neat. Or for like astrophotography, yeah, I would highly recommend a tripod and the time. Astrophotography is a whole different thing, but if you're just talking about like weddings and how to work around low light or work with low light and flash or no flash so that you don't ruin the vibe, everything that I stated before should be super helpful. It just takes practice, and don't give up even when it feels like it's really difficult. I really hope that this is helpful, and also I offer mentorships to go a little bit more in depth about how to utilize flash and how to work in low light situations, because the last thing you want to do is show up to a wedding and not know what you're doing in a low light. Like you show up and it's like There's no white or like light color on the ceiling. It's a dark barn with fairy lights. I don't want to ruin the aesthetic, but I don't know what to do. This is a great starting point. But if you need more information that's more tailored to like you and your camera, yeah, I offer mentorships and I'm more than happy to help. It means a lot to me. And yeah, I just want to be a good resource for all of the folks that are just starting out in photography or have been doing it for a while but have never had a chance to do like low light situations or flash. Just like mess around. It shouldn't be scary. And loom cubes are just fun. They're really fun for like creative stuff where you don't have to worry so much about like being invasive. Okay, if you have any more questions, please let me know. You can comment any questions and I will answer them. You can check me out on Instagram at Lizzy Digital and message me on there. You can email me. It's on my website, LizzyDigital.com. But otherwise, I hope that y'all like this video. Please like and subscribe. I'm trying to get all the information out there and just have like a cool little community of photographers that are inclusive and really care about mastering the art that is photography. I've been doing this for a really long time, so I have a lot of knowledge in here that I would love to just like give to y'all. Okay, I love you guys. Goodbye.